Good afternoon and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Alana Sivan. Earlier this week, Boston's chief prosecutor, Suffolk County District Attorney Rachael Rollins, took a bold step in rectifying what she called the disgraceful chapters in the histories of both her office in the past and the Boston Police Department. Both offices engaged in prosecutorial misconduct and corruption in the case of Sean Ellis, a Black man who spent 22 years in prison on a since overturned conviction for the murder of a Boston police officer. Now, Ellis was released from prison in 2015, and this was in the face of a mountain of evidence suggesting that his case had been severely compromised by this corruption and by this misconduct. But another conviction related to Ellis's possession of the slain officer's gun still stands. But this week, DA Rollins joined Ellis's attorney in a motion that could pave the way for the final outstanding conviction to be overturned. And this is important because overturning this conviction would allow Ellis to file a wrongful conviction suit against the city seeking restitution for the time that he lost while he was incarcerated. And in a statement, DA Rollins explained that she felt that this move was necessary in order to fully acknowledge the wrongs of the past and move forward towards justice. She said that this level of misconduct and indifference by the prosecution team, both Boston Police and Suffolk County District Attorney's Office, cannot be condoned, ignored, or tolerated. We must learn from our mistakes, she said. So joining me now to talk about this latest news and the issue of prosecutorial misconduct is Suffolk County District Attorney Rachael Rollins. DA Rollins, it's such a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you for having me, Alana. And it's Rachael, but yes, thank you for having me. Go ahead.
Thank you, Rachael. I know that overturning a conviction isn't a decision that prosecutors make lightly. So I want to start out by just having you talk to us a little bit more about Mr. Ellis's case and about the Boston Police Department and your predecessor's conduct at the DA's office.
Sure. So many people learned about Sean Ellis's case in the Netflix documentary Trial 4, which was done very well. But Trial 4 isn't evidence. So I inherited an office. I was inaugurated January 2nd, 2019. That had just maybe 2 to 3 weeks before my inauguration made some really big decisions in this case that was incredibly well known in Boston, right? So we have Charles Stewart is a murder that happened in, I believe 1989, 90 time, where a white man and his pregnant wife were leaving a Lamaze class, and the husband claimed that they were carjacked by a, random Black man. The wife was shot and died. Her child, which she gave birth to, died 17 days later, Christopher DeMady. And then Charles's story started unraveling, but not before the Boston police went into a neighborhood in Boston, a predominantly Black neighborhood in Mission Hill, Roxbury, and proceeded to violate constitutional rights, engage in excessive force, and do any number of unconstitutional and untoward things. That is a brand on our city. When something like that happens to you, you don't forget that. And then a few years later, Detective Mulligan, they aren't related with respect to the individuals, but it's only 4 or 5 years later or less that Detective Mulligan is murdered. Boston police detective shot 5 times in the face in his car, tons of media coverage, and a young Black man is arrested very shortly thereafter. And I had heard rumors about the case, but when I took my oath of office, rumors aren't evidence. Neither is Netflix. What we did was we reviewed 39 boxes of documents that I had pulled out of storage regarding all 3 of the trials that the office I lead now had stored somewhere. I reviewed every appeal. I reviewed the internal affairs and the anti-corruption files for all of the disgraced officers, 3 of whom were indicted by the U.S. Attorney on 14 separate counts of civil rights, tax violations, and frauds. 40 of those felonies were dismissed in exchange for them pleading. So we are talking wide scale corruption here. But I was meticulous and made sure, did these 3 officers touch and infect every part of the trial? Every part, I'm sorry, of the investigation. And were they used when we put our case together? And unfortunately, they were. Right. And I mean that, unfortunately, not just for the community, but unfortunately for Mulligan's family. So remember that detective, although he was assuming a lot of risk, and even post-death, the Supreme Judicial Court and trial court has said that he was involved in the crimes that some of his peers were engaged in. He's still a victim, as far as we are concerned, because he was murdered. And so we have a tense relationship with his family, but we sifted through everything before I made the decision. And then I chose, Ilana, to draft the pleading and to sign it myself, because I don't want any retribution against my staff. When you make hard decisions, you stand by them and you make them yourself.
I think it's really important how you talk about how Officer Mulligan is still a victim here, because when there is misconduct, corruption, all of these things that go into investigating someone's case, it hurts everyone. Of course, it hurts the person who their family isn't able to get answers, and it obviously hurts the person who's wrongfully convicted. And so I'm wondering, sort of looking at this at a wider scale, how unusual or usual do you think this level of egregious conduct is in prosecutors' offices across the country and police departments?
So let me make sure, and I know your listenership and viewership is very educated, but just I want to make sure the police engaged in egregious criminal conduct, right? What my office did, and of course I was not leading the office at the time, I was like in college, right? So is we willfully looked away when it came to misconduct that might have been happening. We made the defense fight for every sheet of paper that they were entitled to. And then we withheld some of those records that were, or documents that were exculpatory, right? And so those are called Brady violations. And, you know, although we did not engage in, felonies, they are incredibly egregious, because the prosecution, we have so much power in this process. We have every document before, we know everything, and the criminal defense attorney knows nothing, right? They get all of their records essentially from us. And although there's the concept of, could they have found this out on their own? Look, I chose to be a prosecutor because I wanted to change the way things were working for certain communities that I happen to be a member of. And hear me, that when we do choose to indict a case and move forward with it, there's usually a victim, and we are looking to try to get accountability for that victim. But I don't want to win illegally, right? I am competitive. It's not a competition, but I want to I want to get accountability for these victims with the defense knowing everything. I don't want anything overturned. I want it fair and square. And that is not what happened here, right? The House always wins. And the House is the system, the criminal legal system, the government, whoever. When we cheat, we don't get to win at all. It shouldn't be, oh, well, we only cheated on Tuesdays. If it shows that we cheated, we have to undo the system and start from the beginning, because we have lost all sense of integrity. And we then can't be mad when the community looks at us and says, I'm not going to come forward and tell you who I think murdered this person, or helped solve a crime, or show up for jury duty or grand jury duty, right? Or assist in the process, because I don't believe in the process. We have to show them that when there is this level of corruption, nothing can remain. We have to acknowledge our mistakes and start from the beginning in building trust.
I think your office is probably one of the few offices that has that view. And so I'm wondering why do you think that is? Why do you think so many prosecutors are resistant to this idea of, we need to be looking at everything twice and make sure we're doing things fairly? And what is your message to those prosecutors?
So not only do we need to be looking at everything twice to make sure we're doing it fairly, we need to be unafraid to look back to make sure we got it right. Okay. So we are forward fronting because crime unfortunately continues to happen, but we always have to be willing to look back to say, did we do that right? Like, and we might be me if it's within the last 2 years, or it might be 5 DAs ago, right? Because it happened in 1972 and I was 1 year old, right? So I think a lot of prosecutors are not interested in looking back or making sure they got it right because they assume they've never been questioned before. There's never been this level of, inquiry by the community about what is happening with our criminal legal system. You bet there have been activists and agitants before, but they were able to silence them, right? Or ignore them, or the media wasn't paying attention, or they didn't have the megaphone of whatever the amplifier is. Now with social media and cell phones, there are people that can generate news. They don't need our overwhelmingly white, cis media departments that are only telling their stories through their lens. They are able to get this story, our story, a community story, out to the masses without having to kiss the ring of the media or all these other things. So that's what's changed, number one. And number two, none of them have ever come into contact with the system, right? I notice all the time, Alana, that there are rooms I walk into. I'm the only woman. I'm not often the only person of color in Boston, right? So we had a Black commissioner of police. We have a Black sheriff. We have a Black U.S. Marshal, but I am always the only woman in leadership, right? The chief law enforcement officer in the room. And it is fascinating to me to see this sort of sense of entitlement, right? That we have as law enforcement, and the validators we surround ourselves with, none of whom are from the community, have touched the system, right? Or are returning citizens, right? Like, I mean, touch the system in any way, as a victim, as a witness. We speak for them all the time. And I just refuse to do that. I feel like, look, I come from a long line of veterans and members of law enforcement. I have a deep respect for the people that have served this country and for law enforcement. I hold them to an incredibly high standard, as I should. But I also have siblings that have cycled in and out of the criminal legal system as a result of the deadly cocktail of mental health issues and substance use disorder. And as a result of that, I'm the guardian of 2 of my nieces. So this isn't theoretical for me. I didn't read the new Jim Crow and somehow say like, wow, this is, we got a problem here, right? Like I'm a Black woman, right? So I know this because I have people in my family that have cycled in and out of the system, that haven't been treated fairly, that are overcharged, we're over policed, over prosecuted, over everything. And I am willing to sit and listen and learn, and also to have really tough conversations, and be bold and be proud of the position I'm taking in this elected role. So I think it's different. They don't have lived experience. I think they surround themselves by yes people and other people, and they have an us versus them mentality, right? And who's the them, right? It's usually not anyone. It's not anyone that looks like them, and also they are used to rubber stamping anything the police do. And that's not my job, right? I have the license. I have a bar license. Many police officers aren't licensed, right? And so they get to do all of this misconduct. And then I have to stand up in court and put my bar license on the line for that? No, not today, not any day, right? Under my watch. So that's the point and people are big mad about Sean Ellis, right? Like there are people that, if I told you, and it's sad because this is where we are in our country, and we saw the horrific, we witnessed the execution of 8 people in Atlanta, right? Korean women, Asian women, 1 man, 7 women, 6 of them Asian, or in the AAPI community. We have a level of hate and vitriol and violence in this country that we really need to start addressing. And I think Sean Ellis exposes the fear people have about looking back and saying we made a mistake and now we're going to get to the hard work of figuring out all the harm that came from that mistake and then slowly but surely rebuilding the trust. And you can't do that without acknowledging the mistake and the harm. And that's really what has been very hard for people that are usually in my position and people that are commissioners or in law enforcement.
I want to talk more about the work that you've done to look back. You've made conviction integrity clearly a priority in your office, and you've created an entire unit to identifying and correcting wrongful convictions. So can you tell us more about what this program has been able to achieve so far, and just sort of expound a little bit about why you think it's important when it comes to building and preserving trust in the criminal legal system?
So there's 2 things I've done that I'm, super, super proud of. Right away when I got in the office, before we talk about Conviction Integrity Review Bureau, I created the first in the nation discharge integrity team. So anytime an officer discharges his weapon or her weapon, whether it is fatal or not, anytime there is an excessive force complaint, fatal or not, I have an outside group of experts. I have a retired judge, a criminal defense attorney, a member of the community who runs a community health center and is also sadly a survivor of homicide, and an active member of law enforcement. And I'm the 5th member of the discharge integrity team. I've completely removed it from my office. We don't even meet in my office. We meet at a law firm a mile away. We have people come in and present to us. We we grill them and make sure that they are answering all of our questions. And although the decision lies with me and me alone, these are my board of directors. They direct and control the investigation. They assist me through that process. And we speak to the community throughout. That's the sort of mindset that I started with, right? I started January 2nd, 2019. My first officer involved shooting was February 22nd, 2019. Qasim Kareem was killed by an officer. So it's that level of transparency, it's that level of explanation that I sort of created the Rollins memo in March of 2019, and then we created at the end of 2019 Integrity Review Bureau. And let me explain the difference between conviction integrity and the Integrity Review Bureau. Everyone has conviction integrity. Even the weird conservative DAs that are like, and the answer is yes, we're upholding the conviction. Where are you putting the meat of the conviction integrity? Is it in the integrity or is it in the conviction, right? I'm putting it into the integrity of the process, right? But they only look at the example of like, Alana, you've been in jail for 30 years. You've always maintained your innocence. We didn't believe you. Okay, fine, we'll look. We start looking at information. It's like, oh my God, this trial was awful, right? And then we say you're wrongfully convicted, or they only look at people who are actually innocent, which is an incredibly hard standard to meet. I said, I want Integrity Review Bureau, which is 4 things: conviction integrity, sentencing integrity, case integrity, and the lead database. And so conviction integrity, we talked about, what happened to you is either patently unfair. We have a man who cross-racial murder in 1972. He's Black, that if the victim is white. My office had a policy of striking every Black juror from a cross-racial murder. So an all-white jury convicted him in that homicide. And we looked back on that and said it was unfair. Of course, the law didn't change until after his direct appeal was finalized, and it wasn't retroactive. And I made the statement, I will no longer be legally right and morally wrong. We will agree to reduce that verdict from a first degree to a manslaughter. Arnie King got time served. Manslaughter is capped at 20 years, Alana, in Massachusetts. He had served 49 years. So he's home. We let him out. Sentencing integrity is you and I are together. There's a joint venture. I am the shooter. You are culpable. So you're not innocent, but you are not as culpable as me. You might have handed me the gun. I might have shot them and you kicked them after they were dead or did something, terrible. But with respect to culpability, Alana, you are less culpable, objectively less culpable than I. We have a case, Pedro Valentin, where Pedro was arrested. He was the less culpable one and tried alone and found guilty under a joint venture theory of first-degree murder. A year later, his brother, who had fled the jurisdiction and pulled the trigger and killed the victim, is found, testifies in his own trial with a new jury, and they convict him of second-degree murder. Okay, so the shooter with a different jury, second-degree murder, after testifying to mitigating factors that Pedro never got the benefit of in his trial. So Pedro's doing life without the possibility of parole. His brother is parole eligible and gets out on parole the first time that he is up for parole and has been home for 12 years. We filed something that said, absolutely not. We want to reduce Pedro to manslaughter, time served, and a judge disagreed, but he did reduce it to second-degree murder. So now Pedro is going to be eligible to go before the parole board, which I will testify on his behalf at, right? So that's two. Case integrity is, you know what I don't want to deal with? Finding out we got it wrong 30 years later. There are seminal events that happen every day in a case that under my administration, Alana, now I have to be notified of. So if a grand jury no bills, meaning we put forth all of our case in front of the grand jury, ask them to vote, true bill means, yes, you got it. You can move forward with the indictment. I know you know this. I'm just saying for like my daughter that's watching. Not condescending, I promise. No bill means Commonwealth. What are you wasting our time for? You don't have probable cause. Absolutely not. If a no bill happens in the grand jury, I want to know about it. Not so we can re-present to the grand jury, but who on my staff is wasting the grand jury's time with something that we can't even meet the probable cause standard? There is a saying that you can indict a ham sandwich because it is that easy to indict things. And it's sad, and I apologize, and I didn't make the saying up, but it is such a low burden that I am notified when we get a no bill, so we can get that assistant district attorney training, counseling, or another position, right? Like outside of our office. So that's one. Two, if there is a motion to dismiss or a motion to suppress that's granted, I want the seventh floor to be aware of that, right? If there is a sustained Batson Soares challenge, meaning the defense is saying, why are you striking all the Black women or all the people of color or all the women, some protected category? It has to be sustained, meaning a judge listens and says, you know what, I see a pattern here. This is a problem. I want to know about that immediately. If there is a mistrial, a directed verdict, or anything is flipped on appeal. So what we're trying to do, Alana, is the audit function, right? The problem with the criminal legal system is there's no audit function. If you work in Detroit on an assembly line making iPhones, somebody walks up and picks up the iPhone and says, employee number 9, Rachael Rollins, you were supposed to be putting on this button and making sure this little circle is right here. They check some of yours to see, is she doing it right or not? And if I fail, then I'm pulled off the assembly line. Nobody does that in the criminal legal system. We don't check to make sure we get it right. So that's what case integrity is to me. And the last thing is LEAD, the law enforcement automatic discovery. It's a database where it's basically our Brady list. And I came out with over 100 officers that I put on this list. And that is small, right? We have more that we are adding. And essentially it is so criminal defense lawyers know And everyone knows that these are the officers that are engaged in behavior that is questionable. And what's going to happen with the lead database is pretty soon we're going to have what's called a do not call list, like great DAs like Kim Gardner in St. Louis and others already have. But those are my 4 pillars. And what I promise you, Alana, that no people aren't going to believe me, but I promise it's true. I sit down with law enforcement and I tell them before I do it. They're not happy, but I never want them to feel as if I did not respect them enough to say, this is what I'm doing and why. And they can yell and scream and whatever else. But what they can't say is, she didn't tell us, she didn't look us in the face and say why she's doing this. And I've even adapted with some of the things that they've suggested, and they've been good suggestions. But that's what the Integrity Review Bureau is in Suffolk. And it is so important because the community actually feels like the office is very, very different than it has ever been. They feel heard. And even if the answer is no, they are given the opportunity to speak to me to make their case if they so choose. But we treat them with dignity and respect in the process.
You know, Rachael, something I keep thinking about as you're speaking is yesterday we spoke with 2 district attorneys in Oregon, and one of them said something to the effect of, and they were talking about non-unanimous jury verdicts. And one response that he received to going back through these non-unanimous jury verdicts and considering the possibility of giving them new trials, and one person responded to that to the effect of, well, that's a lot of work, essentially. And I'm paraphrasing, right? But like and you're doing this work and you're going back and going through all of these different cases. And something that he said was, yeah, you have to do a lot of work when you have a system that is so rooted in racism. And again, all paraphrasing.
But whoever that is, I want their cell phone. Like I have never worked harder in my life than in this job, because we are 40 years behind where we need to be. And this is real, Alana. Like we can take away people's liberty, right? We can restrain you. We can put oversight on you. We can deeply impact negatively people's lives. We literally have the ability, think about it. The police are the only branch of our government that have the legal and the lethal authority to kill you without any oversight. And you know whose job it is to look and see if we got it, they made a mistake or not? It's mine. And I take it very seriously. So I say to them all the time, we aren't friends. We aren't friends. I don't dislike you, but yes, we walk into court 80 to 90% of the time together when we are prosecuting a case. But when you are the defendant, we're not friends. And I am not from this office, right? So part of the discharge integrity team is, of course, the community doesn't believe, if DAs and prosecutors and police walk in holding hands every day in court. We know each other's kids' names. They get married. They do all this stuff to then find out, oops, you're the one that's investigating whether that person that you've had trials with before shot and killed somebody and used excessive force. Of course they don't buy it, right? We never talk about the process. And then 4 years later, out pops some decision saying it was reasonable and justified, right? We have to be far better at explaining the process and answering questions and being available to the community, right? Every single time there's an officer involved shooting, I meet with the family of the victim first to personally offer my condolences and to explain the process. And I will tell you, the first Qasim Kareem, when I wrote that press release, I said, an officer was injured. We are wishing him a speedy recovery. And our condolences go out to Mr. Qasim's family, who lost a loved one in this encounter. And the police went ballistic, like somehow acknowledging that another human being lost their lives that night is somehow anti-police. We have our back so far up against the wall. It is really unreal. And the fact that somebody could part their lips to say it's too much work, it's too much work. Like I can't even understand that. Now, I know it's overwhelming to think about all the work that needs to be done, but we have people's lives in our hand. Get ready to work, right? Like, or don't have this job if you're not interested in justice. And that's the difference. As I look at like some of these cases coming out now where I think in St. Louis, the Attorney General said, it's not our job to help the defendant. It's like, well, wait a minute. It's our job to seek justice. That's what our job is. We are ministers of justice, right? Amen. And so for me, I just feel like it is less about defendants and, witnesses or victim. It's more about what is the right thing to do here, right? And as the Commonwealth, I have to think about everyone, the victim, the witnesses, the community, and guess what? The defendant is part of the Commonwealth. Even
by
though
the way, those roles are always so intersecting.
absolutely. Today's defendant could be tomorrow's victim, could be a witness from 3 weeks ago. And guess what? All of them have families that could be grand jurors for me or trial jurors for me. So we have to be far, far, far better at this. I can answer one more question, and then I have children that are running into my house that have to give me a kiss and find out what happened with the rest of the day.
You know what?
So
I'll just let you go. That was such a perfect ending.
Oh, I love it. All right. Well, Alana, I am so excited about you guys. I'm going to be watching more, but we need more warriors for justice, right? And whether you are a defender, a federal defender, a public defender, whether you are, wow, can you guys make more noise? Love you. It's unbelievable. So mean to me.
Bring them in here.
Yeah, whether you are a public defender, a criminal defense attorney, an activist, an adjutant, whoever you are, get involved. We have work to do. So thank you, Alana. Very good to meet you, and keep up the good work. And this is one of my little people leaving.
Have a good one.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Well, so Sean Ellis lost 22 years of his life due to the corruption of the police department and the misconduct of the prosecutor's office at that point. And while a judge recognized that he deserved freedom, he will never gain back those years that he lost behind bars. And there are so many people across the country and in Boston who are just like him. And right now, by supporting his efforts to overturn his conviction and also taking steps to look backwards at other convictions, DA Rollins is trying to give Mr. Ellis not just a second chance at freedom, but a chance to force the city to compensate him for those lost years so that he can build his life back. And again, he's not the only person who has been a victim of this sort of injustice. There are other Sean Ellises waiting in jail cells across the country. And so until prosecutors do what this prosecutor is doing and meet their responsibility to confront the legacies of corruption in their own offices, those other Sean Ellises will keep waiting. It is a lot of work, but it is work that has to be done. Thank you so much for joining us today. That is all the time we have. I'm Alana Sivin. This has been The Appeal Live. You can continue to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. We'll see you next time.